Okay, so you want to own a construction company. You've spent years on job sites, you know how to run a crew, and you're tired of watching someone else's name on the sign take a cut of work you did with your own hands. You picture six-figure contracts, a fleet of trucks with your logo on the door, and a healthy markup on every job. That's the picture in your head. Here's the problem. That markup number you're picturing isn't the number you actually keep, and the gap between the two is where a huge share of construction companies quietly bleed out. Let's start with the illusion, because it's a math mistake almost every first-time contractor makes at least once. Say you apply a 20% markup to a job. Most people assume that means you're keeping 20% of the revenue as profit. You're not. Markup is profit divided by cost. Margin is profit divided by revenue. A 20% markup actually produces a 16.7% margin, not 20%. It sounds like a small difference. Multiply it across every bid you write for the life of your company, and it's the difference between a business plan that works on paper and a business that quietly underprices itself into the ground, one job at a time, without the owner ever noticing exactly why. So what are you actually buying into? There are a few real paths. The general contractor, the most visible role, coordinating subcontractors and owning the client relationship, but also absorbing the most bidding competition, typically netting only 3 to 5% after everything. The specialty trade contractor, electrical, plumbing, concrete, masonry, carrying deeper technical expertise that's harder to replace, and consistently outperforming general contractors on margin, averaging 6 to 9% net, and sometimes reaching into the high teens. And within either path, there's a further split between new construction and service work, repair, maintenance, emergency calls, where margins run meaningfully higher across almost every trade, because a customer whose pipe is actively flooding their basement is a lot less price-sensitive than a customer comparing 5 bids on a new build. Now, what does it actually cost to start? The full range runs from about $53,000 to $245,000 for a lean operation. Licensing, basic tools, a used truck, initial marketing. But that's the minimum, not the realistic number for a company built to actually take on real contracts. Once you're budgeting for a real fleet and heavy equipment, excavators, loaders, dump trucks, total capital requirements climb toward $300,000 to $460,000 or more, with equipment alone frequently running $150,000 to $200,000 of that. Insurance is not optional and not cheap. General liability coverage runs 0.50 cents to $2 per $100 of payroll. Workers' compensation, depending on how dangerous your trade classification is, runs anywhere from 75 cents to a startling $15 per $100 of payroll. A company running $500,000 in annual payroll in a higher-risk trade can be looking at tens of thousands of dollars in workers' comp alone before a single nail gets driven. Here's a cost most first-time owners underestimate, specifically because it doesn't show up as a single bill: overhead discipline. Successful construction companies target 12 to 15% total overhead. Office costs, estimating time, insurance, admin salaries to stay price competitive. Companies that let overhead creep past 20% often can't figure out why they're struggling even when the job site looks busy, because the leak isn't happening on any individual project. It's happening in the background, every single month, on costs that never show up on a client invoice. Now here's where the real trap in this industry lives. And it's not the markup math from earlier, it's cash flow, and specifically something called retainage. On most contracts, the project owner withholds 5 to 10% of every single payment until the project reaches final completion, inspections pass, and all paperwork clears. That sounds reasonable as a protection for the owner. Here's what it actually means for you. Construction margins commonly run in that same low single-digit to high single-digit range. If your net margin on a job is 6% and the owner is withholding 10% in retainage, you are, in a very real sense, financing the final stretch of that project out of your own working capital. Sometimes for a year or more after the physical work is finished, waiting on a defects liability period and a final release that depends on someone else's paperwork. Roughly 70% of contractors and subcontractors report experiencing payment delays on a regular basis. And industry-wide, slow payment is estimated to cost the US construction industry close to $280 billion a year, adding something like 14% to the effective cost of doing business industry-wide. None of that shows up in your bid. All of it shows up in whether you can make payroll in month 11 of a project you already finished building. So where does the real profit actually come from? If the headline markup number is misleading, and a chunk of your earned revenue is sitting locked up in retainage for months at a time. Two places. The first is trade specialization. A general contractor bidding a $2 million project is competing against 4 or 5 other GCs who can all technically do the coordination work. A specialized concrete crew, or a masonry restoration outfit, or an electrical contractor with a narrow certification. Those companies are often one of 2 or 3 qualified operators in an entire region. Less competition means real pricing power, which is exactly why specialty trades consistently post net margins 3 to 4 percentage points higher than general contracting, year after year, regardless of which part of the economic cycle you're in. The second is service and repair work, layered on top of new construction. Emergency and maintenance calls carry meaningfully better margins than competitive new build bidding across nearly every trade, because the customer isn't shopping 5 quotes while their roof is actively leaking. The contractors who build a real service division alongside their construction work aren't just adding a revenue stream, they're adding one of the only revenue streams in this industry that gets paid close to immediately, instead of getting locked up behind a retainage clause for the next 10 months. Let's talk about how this actually breaks, because 2025 and into 2026 has been a genuinely rough stretch for construction companies of every size. In June of 2026, LMC Construction, a masonry, concrete, and restoration contractor based outside Chicago, EPA LeadSafe certified, city licensed, more than a decade in business, filed for Chapter 11 bankruptcy, with liabilities significantly exceeding its assets. This wasn't a fly-by-night operator. This was a credentialed specialty contractor with real institutional and commercial clients, and it wasn't isolated. In the months around it, a Florida-based construction management firm filed Chapter 11 in May. A Montana steel erection contractor filed in April, listing more than 100 creditors. A Nevada roofing and siding company filed the same month. A California general contractor filed the previous November. Different trades, different states, different specialties. The same underlying pattern. Here's the through line connecting all of them. None of these were businesses that ran out of work. Construction spending industry-wide has stayed strong. What connects them is a mismatch between when the cost of doing the work hits the books and when the payment for that work actually clears. The exact retainage and slow pay dynamic described earlier, playing out at scale across an entire industry simultaneously. A company can be genuinely busy, genuinely skilled, and genuinely profitable on paper, and still run out of the actual cash needed to make Friday's payroll, because a meaningful chunk of what it's owed is sitting in somebody else's bank account, tied to a punch list that hasn't been signed off yet. So who actually wins in this business? Not usually the company chasing the biggest, most impressive contract on the sign. It's the companies that understand the difference between markup and margin well enough that their bids actually cover overhead and profit, not just materials and labor. It's the specialty trades that carry real pricing power, instead of fighting 5 other bidders for the same generalist scope. It's the companies disciplined enough to negotiate retainage terms down, pushing for 5% instead of 10%, or a tiered release schedule instead of a lump sum held until the bitter end. Because on a $10 million contract, that's $1 million of working capital either locked up or freed. And it's the companies that build a real service and repair division, so at least part of their revenue clears fast, instead of every dollar being hostage to a project timeline they don't fully control. Now let's put a single year together 2 ways. In the optimistic scenario, you've specialized in a trade with real technical barriers to entry, kept overhead disciplined under 15%, negotiated favorable retainage terms with your major clients, and built a service arm that keeps cash moving between big jobs. A well-run specialty contractor in that position can land net margins in the 10 to 20% range, genuinely strong for this industry, and enough cushion to survive the inevitable slow-paying client without a crisis. In the realistic scenario, a handful of ordinary things go wrong at once. Material costs tick up the way they have across recent years. A major client sits on retainage past the contractual release date, and chasing it costs time and legal fees you didn't budget for. Overhead creeps past 15% because the office grew a little faster than the revenue did. Under those conditions, that same company can slide from a comfortable double-digit margin down into the 3 to 5% range the average general contractor actually experiences. While the job sites stay just as busy, the trucks stay just as full of equipment, and from the street, nothing about the business looks any different than it did the year the margins were healthy. So is it worth it? Construction rewards real technical skill and real physical work in a way few industries do, and demand for buildings, repairs, and infrastructure never really disappears. But surviving as an owner, instead of thriving as a crew leader, requires understanding the difference between what you bid and what you actually keep. Building enough working capital to survive months of your own earned money sitting in someone else's retainage account, and choosing which fights, which trade, which client mix, which contract terms are worth having before you ever pick up a hammer. For the owners who understand that the real business isn't the building going up, it's the cash flow underneath it. This can be one of the most durable industries in the entire economy. For everyone else, the crane keeps running right up until the account that's supposed to be funding it runs dry.